Elliot had always been the type of person who liked peace and quiet, someone who found solace in solitude. After years of renting cramped apartments in the bustling city, he had finally saved enough money to buy a small house on the outskirts. It was a decision he had made without much hesitation. The price was right, and the house was large enough to give him the space he needed. The place was secluded, nestled at the edge of a sleepy town where the streets were more often empty than not. A quiet refuge, perfect for a man who wanted to escape the noise of urban life and focus on his work. The house, however, was far from perfect. It had been vacant for what seemed like years, maybe decades. Its once white walls were now a dull shade of gray, its windows fogged over with dust and grime. The porch sagged beneath the weight of time, its steps creaking with every step Elliot took. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying the faint scent of mold and something else, something that felt a little too familiar. It was the kind of smell that clung to old, forgotten places where no one had dared to enter for a long time. Elliot had hoped the house would be his sanctuary, a place to escape the relentless rhythm of city life, a place where he could breathe and finally get his life back on track. What he didn't expect, however, was the unease that settled into his bones the moment he stepped inside. The living room was spacious, but it felt like it had been frozen in time. A large, old television sat against the far wall, its wooden frame warped with age. The screen was thick and cracked, its surface covered in dust. The dials were rusted, the power cord severed. It had clearly been abandoned long ago, an outdated relic from a bygone era. But still it felt wrong. He had found the television strange, but harmless at first. It was just another forgotten piece of the house, a part of the past left behind by its former inhabitants. But when the first night came, everything changed. That night, Elliot found himself lounging on the couch, the faint hum of his laptop the only sound in the house. It was just after midnight, the hour when everything seemed to grow still and heavy. The house creaked and groaned, its old bones shifting under the weight of time. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching out like an eternity. He had been working for hours, his mind drifting between thoughts of his new life in this house and the work he had yet to finish. And then it happened, a soft click, followed by a crackling sound. He blinked, glancing toward the television. It was on. The screen was filled with static, the white noise swirling in a chaotic dance of flickers. Elliot froze, his heart beating a little faster. He knew for certain that he hadn't touched the TV. It wasn't plugged in. It couldn't be on. But there it was. He leaned forward, unsure of what he was seeing. The static was so thick, it was hard to make sense of anything. But as he stared at the screen, something shifted. A face. A distorted, grotesque face. The features were stretched and unnatural, the eyes wide and empty. The skin was pale and uneven, the mouth twisted into a jagged grin. It wasn't human. It was something else. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as the face seemed to move, slowly drawing closer to the screen. It was as though the face was coming toward him, its hollow eyes locked on his. His legs shook, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. It was as though the face was waiting for him to do something, to react, to acknowledge its existence. His body moved without thinking, and he rose from the couch, stepping closer to the TV. The closer he got, the more the air seemed to thicken, the static growing louder, more oppressive. He reached out a trembling hand toward the dial, wanting to turn it off, to stop the madness. But the moment his fingers brushed the metal, the screen went black. The silence was deafening. Elliot stood there, frozen, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was dark now, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. He slowly backed away from the television, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Was he dreaming? Was he hallucinating? There had to be an explanation, something rational, something that made sense. But there was nothing, just silence, just the faint hum of the house settling into the night. He didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound that might give him a clue about what was happening. Every creak of the house, every shift in the air, felt like a whisper from something unseen. The feeling of being watched settled heavily over him, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The next morning, he tried to convince himself that it was just a fluke, some electrical malfunction, or a trick of the mind. But as the days passed, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The house felt wrong. It wasn't just the old furniture or the dust-covered corners. It was something deeper, something more insidious. And then one night it happened again. It was the same time, just after midnight. Elliot was working at his desk, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep, when he heard it, the soft click followed by the crackling static. He turned, dread pooling in his stomach. There was the television flickering to life, the screen filled with white noise. But this time it was different. This time, the face was gone. Instead, the screen was filled with static, but there was something else. Something moving within the chaos. Shapes. Figures. Shadows. They seemed to twist and shift, contorting in ways that made no sense. At first, they were vague, indistinct. But then, slowly, they started to take form. The shapes began to resemble human figures, tall, hunched, twisted shapes, like they were clawing their way out of the static. And then a voice, a whisper, low and guttural, like something scraping against the walls of the house. Come closer. The word sent a chill through Elliot's spine. He couldn't move. His legs were like lead, his body frozen in place as the figures on the screen shifted and writhed, their faces beginning to form, twisted, malformed faces, eyes wide and empty, their mouths stretched into grotesque smiles. Elliot stumbled back, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His mind screamed at him to turn away, to leave, to get out of the house. But his feet wouldn't move. He was rooted to the spot, staring at the screen as the figures seemed to reach toward him, their hands clawing through the static, inches from the screen, as though they were trying to break free. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the screen went black again. The silence returned. Elliot stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, unable to breathe. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with something he couldn't name. He looked at the TV, then at the door, and finally at the stairs leading up to the second floor. He knew he had to leave. He couldn't stay in this house any longer. But before he could turn and make his way out, he heard something. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Upstairs. The sound was faint at first, but then it grew louder, closer. It was the sound of footsteps on the old wooden floor echoing through the house. Something was walking around in the house, but he was alone. The footsteps stopped just outside his bedroom door. He couldn't move. His body was paralyzed with fear. He wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in his throat. The door creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure, the face from the TV.